Kia ora everybody, and welcome back to Teology, where we drink tea and talk theology. Today we are drinking lychee tea and continuing our discussion on the covenants. So if you remember where we left off last week, we left off with Abraham and discussion about the covenant of pieces. So the next covenant that occurs in the Bible between God and people is the covenant with Moses and Israel. So I would say this is probably one of the biggest covenants in the Bible. Like this covenant, especially in the Old Testament, I would say this is the big covenant. It is this covenant that literally sets Israel up to be the nation that is set apart. You know, we were told about that in Abraham's covenant that was promised, but is this covenant that actually gives them the ability to be set apart in the way that they have to be for God. So we'll dig into this covenant a little bit more and talk a bit about some of the interesting little areas to do with it. However, I do have a little disclaimer that this covenant is huge. Like, there is so much in this covenant that we just will not be able to cover, like, at all. Part of it is because I don't want to bore you for like 12 billion hours sitting here and talking about the ins and outs of this covenant. The other thing is I could never know everything about this covenant. Not that I've known everything about all of the other covenants I've talked about, but I feel like this disclaimer is even more important for this one because there is so much here that I just won't even be able to mention because I won't have time. But also I don't know it, and I don't know everything. Neither do you. None of us know everything in this covenant. As I've been researching, I've been like, there's just so much here that I just wouldn't even know how to begin to say. This covenant is so big that is kind of the central focus of 4 books in the Bible, books 2 to 5. So right at the beginning, very important central focus. It is focus of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. I would say it's even a significant focus in Joshua, so like 5 books of the Bible, because Joshua is all about going into the promised land, which is all a part of the covenant with Israel. So yeah, it's huge, ridiculously huge. And like one of the books, Leviticus and Deuteronomy, does it a huge amount as well. It's just outlining the details of this covenant, which I can't even pretend that I might understand some of Leviticus. So yeah, we're not going to be diving hugely into that today. We'll stick to the stuff it talks about in Exodus mostly, which is the establishing of the covenant, which has been a significant focus for all of these videos, is the covenant's establishment. What the establishment of this covenant means. What weight does that carry? Why is this important? Why should we care about this? This covenant is also, it's the covenant that's made like explicitly with Moses, but it is made with all of Israel. So it's sometimes called the Mosaic Covenant. It is also sometimes called the Sinaitic Covenant because it is made at Mount Sinai. And a lot goes down at Mount Sinai. It would be a really interesting study or something to do, to look at the times and places that Mount Sinai comes up throughout the Bible and what's going on there and what's happening and all of that stuff. But I'm also not doing that in this video. We're talking about the covenant that was made at Mount Sinai. So the covenant is detailed in Exodus 19 to 24, and it is then like repeatedly brought up. It is mentioned again in like Exodus 34 and like the making and establishing of the covenant, but the first time it comes up is Exodus 19 to 24, which is what we'll be focusing on. How is this covenant established? This covenant is established between God and the people of Israel through Moses. So Moses is acting like a mediator in this space. It is done through Moses at Mount Sinai, with the people agreeing to follow the covenant at the beginning of chapter 19, and then the covenant is formed and established, and Moses comes down and presents it to the people, and they say, yep, and then he goes back up for another 40 days, and he comes back down, and it's all gone to chaos. However, when Moses is going back up the mountain to receive and relay the message, the reason it is only him going back up the mountain, or I think it might be him and Aaron, I can't remember at this point exactly, but it is definitely him and like a few other people going up the mountain. And the reason that it is only a few representatives and not the whole nation of Israel is because the people of Israel saw the glory of God fall upon the mountain and went, I'm good. That looks absolutely terrifying and I don't want to die. And while fearing God is an appropriate response to seeing him, God wants us to approach him and be in his presence. So there's an interesting tension there that we have to strike, and I think that I think the Israelites went the wrong way with it, because that is the beginning of a problem, is that they're too scared to even want to be near God, where that is part of the thing of he is absolutely terrifying because it's literally this huge being. And so Aaron was with him when he's receiving the covenant, just double check that, and the covenant is being outlined, and this was quite a long process. So he would like go up and then go back down and then go up and then go back down and then go up, and that we went up for like 40 days and 40 nights one time. And much of what the covenant is that is being given, and why he has to go up and go down and go up and go down, is because it's like a full legal and justice and judicial system that is being given. It is the how can God dwell in your presence, but also how do you interact with each other? How do you deal with disputes between each other in the presence of God? How do we care for the harm that could be done by people in it? How do we respond to that? It is a full legal judicial system. Like Leviticus is law. It is like law writing, which is part of the reason I think a lot of us find it really boring, because it's not really interesting to read legal papers. But anyway, this law book is basically the book of Leviticus. And so Moses read the book of all of that he had written out to the people, and in the process this seals the covenant, and all of the people agreed to this. So this is also a suzerainty covenant, but the thing is, again, what makes it a suzerainty covenant? I think this is the most obvious example in the Bible of a suzerainty covenant, because it is a nation agreeing to be loyal to only one suzerain, that it is a nation agreeing to be faithful to one being, one head, there is a complete unequal power balance there, and he is in that head, which is Godhead, is saying, here is what I will give you, here are my promises, I will dwell in your presence, I will be here, I will be with you when you go into battle, I will fight for you, all of that stuff. They have in essence committed themselves to undivided loyalty to God. The terms of the covenant are initiated by God and agreed upon with Israel. So that's a really important part, is that it is initiated by the suzerain, and there's a vassal, which is Israel, agrees. However, the first command, which is to honor God and is essentially to have no other gods, further reinforces the idea that it is about God's faithfulness here. Or not God's faithfulness, God is always faithful. It's about Israel being faithful to God and God being faithful to Israel. So God in this, he promises to give them the promised land. So at this point of it being made, they've left Egypt, but they're still kind of wandering the desert. They haven't actually gone to the land yet. Regardless of what the Israelites do, God has promised to give the land to the Israelites, that he will make this happen. And it is impossible for God to break his promises, as his promises are also prophecy. And I think we talked about this in the video with Noah, But it's an interesting thing that if God promises something, it's also prophetic because he knows the future and stuff. Anyway, however, this covenant is broken virtually immediately by Israel. Like, Moses has gone up the mountain to like officially receive it. It's like a finalization thing. And they break it. Like, they've just agreed to it and they break it. They make an idol and engage in idol worship. However, God does still fulfill his promise, and he is bound unconditionally to fulfill his promise. He is bound because he never breaks them, and we see the fulfillment of the promised land in Joshua, and we see them becoming a great nation under David and Solomon. This then extends to all of Israel and their children and their children's children, etc. And we see this because when God says, no one from this generation will enter into the promised land, it will be children's children, it will be your children that entered into the promised land. But that's the covenant being passed on from generation to generation. And it extends 4 generations. It extends like right through the entire Bible. It is debated whether or not it's still standing now. I am not going to engage in that debate because I don't really know enough to be able to speak at all educatedly on it, and I don't even know enough to pretend that I know enough. And that is why it's a suzerainty covenant, because it extends for these generations. It is filled with promises that God is making to the people of Israel. The people of Israel are promising an undivided loyalty and utter faithfulness to God in that. And God is agreeing to be faithful to them in the giving of his promises. There are a couple of other really interesting things with this covenant. So, one is that it is the only place in the Bible where it is not said to be written with human hands or through humans in the same way as the rest of the Bible is perceived to be, but is straight from God. This specifically being the 10 Commandments, I think. So this is stated explicitly in Exodus 31:18, which says, when the Lord finished speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai, he gave him 2 tablets of the covenant of the law, the covenant law, the tablets of the stone inscribed by the finger of God. So this is really interesting, as in the rest of the Bible, it is said and talked about as being like the divinely inspired word of God. So there is still an element of humanity in the writing of it. But in this, it isn't written by human hands. It isn't, or anything like that. It is straight from the finger of God, inscribing it on the tablets himself. Now, that doesn't mean that the rest of the Bible isn't from God, it isn't the word from God and that type of thing. It's just, it means it's a bit different. It means it's like, it is written through special and divine revelation to write what they wrote. However, the 10 Commandments, the covenant law, is considered differently, as it was God who wrote them directly. One of the other very interesting things with this covenant is that a lot of it is about sacrifice, and there are animal sacrifices made for atonement, to cover sin, to cover guilt, and the brokenness and such from the Israelites, to ensure that God can continue dwelling in their presence. He is holy and pure in everything that is good, and so if he is in the presence of sin, it is physically not possible. There has to be that atonement that is made, and that has to be made so that God can reside and be in their presence, that he can make the temple or tabernacle in Israel his resting and dwelling place. This isn't the only reason for sacrifice, but it is basically the main reason for the sacrifice. And they're mostly to do with the idea of being unclean and to atone for something. This idea of sacrifice, of atonement and the sin offering, is probably one of the most talked about ones in the Old Testament, though it isn't the only one involved in the law. If you want to know more about that, there are whole sections talking about why there are the different sacrifices that there are. However, the entire law in Leviticus is a whole judicial and legal system that even if we wanted to, we couldn't apply it in our lives at all appropriately, because it's made so that a nation can set itself apart. It is a whole legal system that is a way for a nation to live that is counter to the world. And while we are called to do that, we can't do it in the way that it says in Leviticus, because we are but one people. We don't govern the nation. It is dependent on multiple people, on a community, all living that way, and is dependent on the nation living that way. And it also, when you look at it, a lot of the things in Leviticus are there to set them apart from the other nations around them. So it is about setting them apart and making them not look like the other nations that are around them. And there are lots of examples that people have put together of like, this is what these nations were like around Israel, and this is how Israel's law says that they had to be different. So it's all about being set apart as a people of God. And it is about relying on God and relying on his guidance to oversee them, to be in charge and to be the leadership. And that is still really important for Christians today, is to go, how can we be counter to the world? How can we not be what the world makes us out that we should be? How can we be different in a way that shows God and a way that is truly reflective of him? How can we be set apart by God? Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all next week. Bye.